Good day, dear children. Hope all of you are fine. As you all know, we have 4 sections in our English core subject: reading, writing, literature, speaking and listening. We have been doing writing skills so far. Now today we will begin with literature. We have 2 textbooks, Hornbill and Snapshots. We will do Hornbill textbook today, and the first chapter is The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. What do you mean by a portrait? It's either a picture or a photograph or a painting of a person or a scenery or anything for that matter. Now, who is the lady mentioned here in the title? Khushwant Singh refers to his grandmother in the title. Now, have you heard of the writer Khushwant Singh? He was born on 2nd February 1915 and lived till 20th March 2014. He was an Indian author, a lawyer, diplomat, journalist and a politician. His experience in the 1947 partition of India inspired him to write the novel Train to Pakistan, which became his most well-known novel. In this chapter, the author tells us about his grandmother. He had known her for 20 years and he beautifully describes the relationship with her over the years. He even pens down her daily activities and how she evolved as a character as time passed by. He explains her appearance in a picturesque manner, and once you finish reading the story, the impression of the author's grandmother will definitely remain in your mind. Let's begin. The first paragraph. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. That's very interesting, no? Everybody has a grandmother who is old. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. Just underline that particular sentence. Hard to believe. What was hard to believe for the author? It was very difficult for him to believe that grandmother was at one time young and pretty, but ever since he had seen his grandmother, she had been old and wrinkled. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could have only lots and lots of grandchildren. Now let's continue. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. So there's a question there. Which was the thought which was almost revolting? That the grandmother was once young and pretty. What do you mean by revolting thought? The very idea would cause disapproval. It was very difficult to take in that particular idea that grandmother was once young and pretty. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. Here again the author continues to confirm the idea that he could not connect himself to the thought that she was once young and pretty. When his grandmother narrated the stories of her childhood, he felt it illogical because it was beyond his imagination. Now the second paragraph. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a criss-cross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled, she moved around the house in spotless white with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop that is bent, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks, that is her silver hair, white hair, was scattered untidily over her pale, puckered, wrinkled face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Inaudible, not properly heard. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Here the author proceeds to describe the grandmother further, and he says that she was old with the wrinkles on her face, but she was beautiful. What is the difference between the words pretty and beautiful in the context? The word pretty refers to the external beauty, whereas the word beautiful also refers to the inner beauty. So, grandmother was a person who radiated peace and contentment wherever she moves around. Next paragraph. My grandmother and I were good friends. This is stage 1. You can write in the margin stage 1 and underline the point good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice, but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick, stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. So the whole paragraph deals with his condition in the village. This takes place in the village where grandmother and the author were good friends. That's the first point. Now the second point, what did she do for him? She used to wake him up in the morning, get him ready for school, and made him dressed up for school, and then accompanied him to school. So what are the things that grandmother did for the author, and how was he attached to the grandmother? That is what is dealt in the paragraph. Now we proceed. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. Underline, very important point. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer. Underline the contents that they learned in the school. While the children sat in the rows on either side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus, my grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They would follow us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. So again, we get more details about the relationship between the grandmother and Kushwant Singh. Now, why did grandmother accompany the author to the temple, to the school that he was studying? He was in the village and his father and mother had entrusted him in the hands of grandmother. So she accompanied the boy to the school. And the second important point is grandmother was a religious lady. How do you know that? How did she spend her time in the temple? She read the scriptures and spent her time. Another point is she sang the morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song manner so that the author would learn it by heart. So these are the 2 points that shows that grandmother was a religious lady. You can add one more point, that is she used to tell the beads of the rosary almost all the time of the day. She was also a kind-hearted woman. How do you know that? She fed the village dogs with the chapatis that she brought with her. Now let's move on to the next paragraph. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, underline the word city, this is stage 2, they sent for us. That means both grandmother and the author were taken to the city. That was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. So, the major change that happened here was grandmother did not accompany the author to school anymore, and there were no dogs in the streets that she could feed. And now, what did she do instead? She fed the sparrows in the courtyard of their city house. Now, next paragraph. As the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time, she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. I would tell her English words and little things of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. This made her unhappy. So that was a very important question there. What made the grandmother unhappy? Grandmother was not happy about the content that was taught to the author in the English school. She could not help me with my lessons. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. One day I announced that we were being given music lessons. She was very disturbed. To her, music had lewd associations. It was the monopoly of harlots and beggars and not meant for gentlefolk. She said nothing, but her silence meant disapproval. She rarely talked to me after that. So here you find there are 3 important points which made her unhappy, 3 important things that happened in the English school. The first one is they taught him music lessons. They taught him science, principles of science, which grandmother couldn't help. And over and above, there was no teaching of God. And she feels that music is associated with harlots and beggars and not meant for good people. Now, third point, third stage of the author's life is the university. When I went up to university, I was given a room of my own. The common link of friendship was snapped, was broken. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. She accepted the fact that she is all alone right now without anything much to do, but she accepted it with happiness. She rarely left her spinning wheel to talk to anyone. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her wheel, spinning and reciting prayers. Only in the afternoon she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. While she sat in the veranda, breaking the bread into little bits, hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirrupings. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders. Some even sat on her head. She smiled but never shooed them away. It used to be the happiest half hour of the day for her. So, how did the grandmother spend time in the city? She recited prayers. She took to spinning wheel. Third one, she fed the sparrows. And feeding the sparrows was supposed to be the happiest time of the day for her. So, she found her own way to spend time in the city when others in the house were busy with their daily works. Thus, we come to the end of part 1. Thank you, children.